everyone, my name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today I am doing a Patreon requested video, so always remember that I do have a reward tier on Patreon where you guys can suggest video topics for me to do. It's the only way I can guarantee that I will talk about something, so if that interests you, check it out. But today the Patreon requested video is about finding your submissive style. So this is actually a follow-up to a video I did a few weeks ago now where I talked about how to find your dominant style. So if you haven't seen that already, I do recommend you check it out because there is definitely a lot of overlap between these two subject areas, in particular with manners and finding self-confidence, that kind of thing. It's just good life advice in general. Even if you're not into BDSM, it can be very helpful for finding successful relationships. But I do find there are a lot of differences between finding a submissive style versus finding a dominant style. I find with dominance, at least from my knowledge, we kind of expect them to already have things totally figured out. Like, they just pronounce one day, I'm a dominant, and here's exactly what I am, and here's my closet full of all of these domly dom clothes, and my chest full of domly dom toys, and I'm ready to go. And we kind of expect almost the opposite from submissives. One of the very first experiences I had at a BDSM play party, it was literally my very first one, is I had a guy go up to me when I was in like a pet playpen, and he asked, you know, oh, like, what are you interested in? Like, what are you into? And I told him that I was into pet play and I was curious about being a submissive, and he basically went like, oh, you know, you don't have to have everything, like, figured out yet. You know, a dom is there to tell a submissive what to be. Or, like, something along those lines, where it's basically like a dom tells a submissive how they should be submissive, which is, not what I've actually experienced in real life. That is definitely not something that is universally true by any means. So we basically expect doms to have everything already figured out, and we expect submissives to be totally pliable and able to be whatever their dominant wants them to be. So that obviously causes some problems for people. But what I want to do today is I want to break down some helpful processes that you might be able to use to help find your own style as a submissive, help figure out what kind of submissive you are, and help figure out what you want for power exchange relationships. Now, obviously, this is going to be focused on submission and power exchange, such as that happens to be part of it. Now, the process I think is very similar for bottoms, so people who don't involve power exchange in their play. But you can definitely apply all of this different advice to bottoms, just with, you know, your own particular bottomy grain of salt. But let's go ahead and get into it. The first thing that I want to talk about is, as usual, the process of introspection. If you have been around on this channel for a while, you know that I am a very big fan of introspection. I think introspection is absolutely key with understanding what you want out of BDSM. Unless you are somebody who is finding themselves in the role of a submissive purely because their partner has suggested it and you have never thought about it yourself, chances are there was something that originally drew you to be curious about the world of BDSM. There was some sort of spark of curiosity that happened that made you actually want to pursue this as potentially part of an actual real-life relationship. That could be maybe you watched a secretary and you couldn't get the ideas from the scenes out of your head for a long time, or you read this fantastic erotica that involved, you know, being a Victorian maid and having a lot of spanking, or maybe you saw like a post of some pets or some littles on Instagram or on Tumblr. Rest in peace, Tumblr. That really sparked your curiosity and you wanted to find more. But whatever that is, whatever that little nugget was, think about it, because chances are there was probably something, there was probably at some point a catalyst that made you realize that this was something you actually wanted to really pursue and really actually wanted to seriously consider doing. This is not to say that that one thing, that one spark, is actually what's going to be what your submissive style is, or be the only thing you like by any means, but it is a good place to start because it was something that got you interested in it. And what you can do, even if it's not literally, oh, it's the pet play, it's the age play, it's the whatever, that's what you want about it. Think about what about that did I find appealing? Did I like the aspect of role play? Did I like the costuming? Did I like the idea of corporal punishment? Did I like the idea of being able to surrender complete control? Did I like the idea of being able to experience intense sensations? Did I like the idea of being able to completely forget my everyday vanilla life and become somebody else? You know, there's lots of different possibilities, but being able to evaluate why that one particular thing maybe appealed to you can help you find kind of related terms maybe, or related concepts that also overlap with that same overarching theme. Now, when you are doing this evaluation of what got you interested in BDSM, there's a couple of different tools that you can use now and throughout your entire journey of discovering yourself as a submissive. The first thing I always recommend is journaling. Journaling is fantastic. It's a great way to get your ideas and thoughts in the moment, collect them, and be able to look back on them retrospectively and kind of identify any necessary trends or patterns. If you are really into the writing thing, another step you can take beyond just merely journaling your thoughts is actually writing down your fantasies, writing down your ideal BDSM scenario without any reservation or judgment. Now, this takes a lot of practice because a lot of us are very inhibited, not necessarily for any particular reason, but we just naturally kind of are disconnected from our deeper, more intimate desires, and being able to just kind of write out, freestyle, whatever fantasies that you have, as deep and as dark and as weird as they are, can really help you figure out, okay, this is why I'm actually interested in this thing. If you just allow yourself to have a few moments where you're not inhibited, where you are just able to put out on your thoughts, and you know, you don't have to keep the paper you write the fantasy on. If it's just too much for you, you can burn it, you can throw it away, you can shred it, whatever, but just having the exercise of writing down what those core fantasies are can be very important to identifying, oh, this is why I'm interested in BDSM. This is maybe the type of submission that appeals to me. If you're not really a writing person, there are a lot of visual things you might want to do instead. One of the big things I like the idea of is having a submissive mood board. So you kind of take maybe the visual elements of different things that you enjoy. Maybe you have printouts of things that you saw on Instagram that you liked, or maybe clippings from erotica that you enjoyed reading. Whatever it is, you put it up on the mood board and you can kind of identify, you know, different patterns about, oh, these are the sorts of things that I like. This is the sort of visual aesthetic that I want to be going for. And that can really be a good exercise as well. If you're crafty, you can actually make your own physical mood board. If you don't have that much time or resources, you can also just do something like this on Pinterest even. So those are just some ways you can start the process of introspection. Now, naturally, the next thing that a lot of people gravitate towards is finding their label or finding an archetype. It's like the number one thing that I know happened for me when I was first discovering BDSM. I know it's what a lot of people gravitate towards next, just through conversations that I've had online and with my friends. You know, once you discover the world of BDSM, you want to find the box that you can jump into. You're like, okay, what am I? And beyond just figuring out, okay, am I a dom or a switch or a sub, you find out that the sub box is actually a box made up of a lot of different other boxes, and you're like, okay, which one of these do I actually fit into? And I want to make sure that I can fit myself into that exact box because that seems like a good thing, and I'm just gonna like make myself fit that. No, don't do that. That's a bad thing to do. And I know it's really tempting to be like, but I want to be the most perfect slave. I want to be the most perfect blah, blah, blah. And the thing about labels is labels should work for you. If you don't take anything else away from this video, take this away. Labels should work for you. You should not work for labels. It's really a hard habit to break, but I find that long term, the best thing you can do to yourself is find your own genuine, natural style of submission, rather than changing your behavior, changing your personality on a fundamental level to try and fit your perceived expectations of what you believe that label means you should be. Labels are flexible. There are people who will argue about them. There are a lot of opinions that the community has about different types of labels, but ultimately, at the end of the day, you are the one who gets to define what that label means to you and to your relationships, and that is not anybody else's business. And so, if that means that you are little who doesn't like pacifiers, that's okay. If that means you're a pet pet who's a mythical creature, that's fucking okay. It's all okay. It's about what works for you. Now, obviously, within the consent and negotiated boundaries of the relationships you happen to find yourself in. If you just have no idea about where to start with labels, if none of this is familiar to you at all, there's a website that a lot of people find helpful called BDSMtest.org, and that is a good way to get some kind of initial results into what you might be curious about. Particularly if you're not sure, maybe if you're more of a dom or a sub or a switch or whatever, the way the results pan out is you might find out, oh, I'm 100% a pet or 100% a brat or whatever it happens to be. This is not to say that you should bend yourself to fit the mold of the results of that test, but it is a good way to get ideas of what to Google. This is how I first came across the term primal play, for example, and that led me down the path that eventually led me to making YouTube videos. So it is certainly a helpful resource for a lot of people if you are not familiar with any types of terms and want a quiz to be able to kind of guide you maybe in some core key directions. Some of the more common labels that you might want to think about would be little, girl, boy, slave, kujira, sub, pet, property, slut, toy, sissy, and beyond. There are lots of even subcategories within this, so some littles, for example, might identify with the term princess or baby girl. Some pets might be kittens or puppies or ponies. There's lots of even subcategories within these subcategories, but they are just genuine labels that maybe you connect with on some level. So when you are, for example, looking at lists of different types of submissives online, think about, like, what about these labels appeal to me? Are there any ones that I'm drawn to? Are there any ones that definitely don't seem like they're for me at all? And take all that information and just kind of use that to be able to guide yourself. A related term to labels that I have not found a perfect way of describing the difference of is archetypes. I would say that labels are generally something that's more associated with a larger community structure or some kind of larger community understanding. So there are community spaces for pets, for example, or for littles, or for slaves, and they're all kind of understood within the community to have certain elements that go along with those specific terms. Whereas archetypes, I find, are more stylistic, different examples of how you might find yourself in being a submissive. And you can have labels that are archetypes and archetypes that are labels and, you know, all that fun stuff. It gets very complicated, but hopefully you'll kind of understand that, like, okay, labels are like community understood terms versus archetypes, which don't necessarily maybe have a larger community consensus about them, but are maybe different elements, different flavors that you could add to a BDSM relationship. Some of these might, for example, include being a vampire thrall, or a Victorian maid, or a lady-in-waiting, or a princess, or a baby girl, or a brat, or a secretary, or a personal assistant, or a military subordinate, or a tamed animal, or a housewife, or a house husband, and a bunch of other ones as well. But those are just some particular stylistic examples, and again, kind of go through the process of evaluating, do any of these speak to me? Are there any larger roles that I'm kind of interested in fulfilling that I might want to have as kind of an aspect of the flavor of my BDSM play? Now, beyond just the archetypes that I mentioned already, or the community labels that already exist, there are lots of different ways of getting outside inspiration for your BDSM style as a submissive. Visual media is, of course, a huge thing. So some examples of that might be things like The Secretary, The Handmaid, The Favorite. There's actually a lot of movies that have come out recently that involve kind of subtle power exchange elements to them, which is really fascinating. So I highly recommend, if you are a visual person, if you like watching things, go out and watch movies. Are there any elements in them, especially in historical dramas, I have noticed, that involve elements of power exchange? Are there things about that you find appealing that maybe, you know, kind of turn you on, for lack of a better term, that you might find interesting in having in a BDSM relationship or in a scene? Now, the thing with these is you have to be really careful and remember that these are not actual representations of BDSM relationships for the most part. They are either, you know, pure fantasy, or you're going to have to read into it to find it, or it's, you know, just something that has nothing to do with BDSM, but kind of, you know, for a BDSM audience, you can kind of see elements of it in there. And so you need to remember that it's not about literally replicating the actions of the people in those movies, but taking inspiration from the way that they act, walk, talk, you know, kind of just the vibe, the energy of those relationships in general. You know, what about them do you in particular find, you know, interesting? In my dominant video, I kind of really left it just to the visual aspect of things, because I find that dominants especially get a lot out of sort of the more visual representations of dominance, kind of the posture and the clothing and things like that. And I find for submissives, while there is not necessarily as strong of a representation in that category, you can very oftentimes find really good representations of submission in things like erotica and romance novels, kind of being able to read that language, which going through the mind oftentimes of the person who's playing the more submissive role. And so that can also be a really good resource as well. If you're not somebody who's maybe into movies, there's lots of good written resources out there as well. Now, of course, you don't have to just take inspiration from things that you see represented in media. There are, as it happens to be because I am on YouTube, a lot of actual good resources and inspirations out there for if you want to take inspiration directly from other people who are already interested in BDSM. What is an interesting hang-up that I've noticed about the online community is a lot of people are very paranoid about copying other people. And people get accused of copying. They're afraid of getting accused of copying because they bought the same ears as somebody else, or they're wearing the same color of collar, or whatever it is. Personally, I find this a little bit juvenile and petty. I think it is okay to take inspiration from the people around you. If you are on Tumblr, Twitter, Instagram, etc., on FetLife, and you see things that are interesting to you, don't feel like you can't take that into your own personal style. Now, completely copying somebody and making yourself a clone of them, I don't recommend that. It's not healthy for anybody. But if you want to take little elements and go, oh, okay, I really like how they did their hair this one way. I think that really gives this one, you know, energy to it that I like. Or I really like how they did this thing. Or this seems really interesting and I want to try that too. Totally okay to take those for yourself, and it's totally okay to kind of incorporate it into who you are and kind of just try things on for size, because that's kind of the process of figuring out who you are. It's trying on different things and seeing what works. Now, beyond just being on the internet, there are lots of great opportunities to do this in real life as well. I highly recommend, if you haven't done it before, to go to things like munches and dungeons, go to parties, meet people, see what they do, observe your surroundings. Observation is absolutely key. If you want to be able to know what type of submissive you are, it might be helpful to see other actual submissives in action. Some things to potentially look out for example, if you happen to be at a BDSM party, is see what do the other submissives wear? How do they address people? How do they hold their bodies? Do they make eye contact? How do they behave when they are in scene? Do they laugh? Do they giggle? Are they bratty? Do they fight back? Are they just completely still and quiet? Do they speak only when spoken to? Do they speak freely? How do they interact with people who aren't their partner? Do they hang out with other submissives? What do they do for aftercare? Do they set up the scene themselves? Do they clean up the toys? Kind of just, in general, observe how people conduct themselves in BDSM spaces and see, is there anything in that behavior that kind of speaks to me, is something I might want to try out myself, or is maybe something I know I'm interested in but don't know how to incorporate or actually behave like in real life. And just being able to see those examples is really helpful. Now, if you're brave, you can take it a step further and you can talk to people, which is another amazing thing to do. Most people, if it's an appropriate time, i.e. not in the middle of a scene, are happy to talk about their experiences being submissive, talk to you about where they found certain items of clothing or what their Instagram is or whatever else. They are happy to give advice and talk about their experiences. Now as well, I would remember, especially if you are somebody who's watching this that's younger, don't be afraid to talk to the older people. I know a lot of people who are brand new, who are 18, 19, getting into the scene, are like, oh, I don't want to talk to the scary, weird older people. And like, Some of them, I'm sure, because this is something that it happens regardless of your age, just by virtue of being human, there are going to be people who are weird and creepy, but it's definitely not exclusive to the older people. People who are older than you are oftentimes more experienced, though not always, because you can start doing BDSM at pretty much any age, you know, as long as it's above the age of 18. You know, people who have had more experience going through the process of finding who they are being submissive can offer a lot of really great insight and be able to help you on your journey, connect you to resources, help you find other people who are kind of in similar situations. So just don't be afraid to make connections. You never know where that's going to end up. Now, once you have done all of this fabulous introspection and observing and journaling and really thinking about what you want, the next step is obviously trying things out. Now, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is focused around obviously the power exchange parts that define submission versus being a bottom. But I think when you are first trying to kind of figure out your submissive style, it's helpful to do it at first without the influence perhaps of a dominant partner, because then you get to kind of figure out what genuinely just for you kind of works without having to deal with anybody's energy involved. And there are ways of kind of trying things on for size without even having to do a scene. So some examples of this would be, if you're interested in pet play, going to a mosh, maybe wearing some pet play gear, trying on a harness. If you're a little, going to a dungeon party with maybe a pacifier or some kind of t-shirt or clothing that kind of represents your little side, or wearing some kind of clothing. If you are interested in some kind of role play aspect, maybe wearing an article of clothing or a uniform that goes along with that. If you are interested in service submission, you can actually oftentimes volunteer to be a server at a protocol event without having to have your own partner. And all of these things are ways that you can explore kind of different elements perhaps of your submission without having to worry about other people's expectations of you or doing what your dominant wants, and just kind of genuinely being able to explore for you by yourself what actually works, and feeling free to be able to change it if it doesn't, because that's another big thing as well. When you are first getting started doing anything in BDSM, be it trying to find yourself as a submissive or play that you like or whatever, there's always that element of fantasy versus reality. You can think for years and years and years, you know, since the first time I ever thought about BDSM, I thought I was going to be this one thing, or this one thing always seemed really hot to me, and then you go and do it, and then it's not as great as you thought it was. That's totally okay. I think really the biggest thing that you can do for yourself when it comes to finding yourself as a submissive, finding your own style, is being open to the possibilities and not trying to hold on to one tiny little nugget of something you believe you must be. Rather than kind of holding on to the nugget and think, I have to be this thing, I have to be this thing, I have to be this thing, and this has to work out, or I'm not going to know what I'm going to do. Just be open to the experience of existing. Be open to the experiences of what could possibly be. Now, this is not to say that you should go out saying, I don't have any hard limits or anything like that, but being open to the possibility that you might change your mind about something. That something that works for you, or you thought it would, doesn't. Or something that you first thought, oh, I don't really think that's for me. Maybe over time you will warm up to the idea, and that's okay. Now, if you don't have access to a dungeon, if you don't feel comfortable going to play parties to yourself, there are lots of other ways that you can learn more about your style of submission. Obviously, I do recommend going to things like discussion groups and munches so you can meet people and kind of see how they do things and kind of what maybe would work for you in real life based on those observations. As well, another big thing you could do is take classes. Classes are a great way of learning about something that you might be curious about but aren't sure if it's going to work for you. Be able to see how it actually works. Does it actually kind of play out maybe the way you want it to in a fantasy? Is it something you're actually comfortable doing? You know, kind of just figuring out, trying on things for size without actually having to try them on for size. So classes are great for that. Classes are also a really great way of building skills, because a big aspect for a lot of people of submission is providing service, and being able to build up or try out different aspects of service can be a really interesting and helpful thing. So maybe you learn about position training, or maybe you learn about boot blacking, or maybe you even do some vanilla things. Those can be great as well. Cooking and basic housekeeping, you know, how to budget, how to take care of a checkbook. If you're into more sort of handyman type things, you can also learn those skills as well. You can go to classes for how to mix drinks or how to decorate cakes. You can learn how to do massage therapy even. There are lots of different sorts of things, vanilla and kinky, that you can use to develop a skill set to kind of try things out and say, do I actually want to have this as like maybe part of a relationship? And a lot of these things are what I would call maybe a little bit more bottom focused. That is, they are skills that you would use in a scene, but they're not necessarily involving power exchange, although they can be. So actually what I really think is helpful for a lot of people when you're finding your submissive style is to start out bottoming first. There's a few reasons for that. It gives you practice at negotiation. It gives you practice using your safe words. It gives you practice trying to evaluate, you know, what partners are going to work for you or not. And within those little nuggets of scenes, you can find elements that maybe you might want to bring into a larger power exchange context. So maybe you might find, for example, that wax play, for whatever reason, brings out your inner untamed animal. Maybe you find that, you know, doing service submission really makes you totally zen and is absolutely what you want to do, and you want to do it in a power exchange context. Or maybe you find that bondage makes you the absolute worst brat and gives you a horrible potty mouth. You never know what's going to happen until you're actually in the moment, in the scene. And being able to be open to those experiences and kind of find and evaluate, oh, that's interesting, this type of play makes me act this way, and I want to be able to pursue that more, and this is something that I want to do a lot, and this feels really good to me. You know, all of that is great information to have, and having that practice as a bottom, I really do believe will help prepare you for a power exchange relationship. And that brings me on to my last section of this video, which is the relationship part of power exchange and submission. Because even though I do think people that are submissive and have that be, you know, a big part of their lives, you know, are naturally that way, they have a natural style to themselves. Usually people who are submissive are that because they want somebody that they could be submissive to. And when you have, you know, the urge to be submissive to somebody, it's probably a good idea to know beforehand what you want that submission to kind of look like. Now, you don't need to have everything totally laid out and planned and have, I want this and this and that, I don't want that and that and that. Like, you don't need to be super exhaustive with it, but I have seen and heard time and time again the people who don't have limits, the people who don't know what they want and just go, do whatever you want to me, master, I will be your perfect slave. And that is how you end up in really bad situations, so don't do that. You will have more success having healthier, longer-term relationships with people if you take time beforehand to figure out what your own tendencies are, which is the whole point of this video. Style goes beyond just merely what type of play you like and what type of role you like, but also into the core fundamental parts of the relationship. Do you want a monogamous relationship or a non-monogamous relationship? Do you want something sexual or non-sexual? Do you want your dominant partner to also be your romantic partner? Are you going to expect them to be able to meet your parents someday? Do you want something that's totally sexual and not romantic at all? Do you want to combine things? Do you want something that's purely like friendship only, just outside of what you do in a power exchange relationship? What level of power exchange do you want? Do you want something that's 24/7 and total power exchange at some point? Do you want to keep it kind of lower key? Do you want it to be on the weekends only? What elements of submission are appealing to you? So for example, do you want to give up authority over what panties you wear, what clothing you wear every day, how you style your hair? Are you somebody who wants to be able to give up total control over everything? Do you want to have really detailed rules in a contract? Do you want to keep things maybe a little bit more naturally flowing? Do you want something where you have particular fetish needs fulfilled? Do you have any core kinks you want to be able to include in a relationship? What kind of titles do you want to be able to use for each other? You know, do you want to have something where you're able to call your partner daddy, you know, 24/7? Just those sorts of things are things you want to think about before you go into a relationship. Something that was really helpful that I learned about recently at KinkFest that I talked about in another video was Melina Williams' concept of having your desires, wants, and needs for relationship outlined. And even if at first you're not really sure what that is, or you're like, I don't even know what my wants and desires are, that's fine. Just take time to think about it. Take time to kind of sit with yourself about it before you go into a negotiation with another person. Because if you don't know what you want before you go into a negotiation, it's very likely you will end up with a relationship that's not going to work for you long term. And of course, you can't always renegotiate, you can't always reevaluate things, but when you want to be able to have a deeper conversation about that first before you get into the relationship, as opposed to 6 months, a year, 2 years in, I think I probably would. Now, the last thing that I want to note here when it comes to building power exchange relationships and finding yourself as a submissive within those relationships is you may find that dominants can pull out very unexpected energy from you. This is not to say that they should be allowed to do things that are hard limits, but you may kind of just be meh about, say, pet play, and then suddenly you find the person who is the absolute perfect pony trainer for you, and suddenly you go down into the wonderful world of delving into pony play. And maybe you might not have ever expected that, but different dominants, if they are compatible in some ways, will likely be able to pull out things from you that you wouldn't have considered possible if you had just thought about them on your own without their influence. So there is some elements of power exchange where you do kind of have to be open to things that maybe you hadn't really considered before. Again, not really violating hard limits or doing things that are totally gross to you, but maybe you might find that things you hadn't really thought about before become things that are really important elements to your relationship. And really, it's about being able to be flexible, being able to communicate honestly with your partner, and being able to be true to yourself and honest about what your needs and values are. The process of discovering yourself in BDSM is a really long process, or it can be. There's lots of different things to know, things that I haven't been able to cover in this video, and this is by no means a complete guide. So if you want to know more about things like negotiation, going into detail about certain areas of BDSM, red flags, how to find a dungeon, how to meet people, I have videos on all of those subjects, so be sure to check out some of the links down in the description box below, and also be sure to search my channel because I have a bunch of videos and chances are I have it linked to all of them in the description box of the video down below. If you guys have any comments or questions for me, you can do that down in the comment section below. I'm always happy to hear from you all. If you like this video, if you want to know more about BDSM and you haven't already, please do subscribe. I make videos twice a week. And finally, if you really enjoyed this video, if you want to support my channel, if you want to see videos that I can't post on YouTube, if you want to have access to exclusive photo shoots and a Discord chat, you can check all that out over on Patreon. Link to that will be down in the description box below. If you guys already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. You are what makes this possible. And until I see you guys next time, hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.